Frontiers in Bioscience podcast series, where we discuss our past cosmic and biological evolution and our path to own biological and cosmic fate. I am your host, Dr. Sai. Hello, welcome back to Frontiers in Bioscience podcast series. Every time that you come back, I hope that I can empower you and give you some of my ideas, especially in my own field, which is anti-aging research. I hope that you continue to watch this series of podcasts, and I'm hoping that we can get sponsors because we in my lab have been able to, at least in the laboratory, reverse aging, and we need a lot of funds to bring that kind of research to its beautiful ending and give it as a... Today, we are going to discuss an important subject, consciousness and free will. I have my own belief, and I hope that if you disagree with me, you can come on my podcast, and I would be delighted to speak to you and listen to you. And if you oppose me, you will see that I will, with all my heart, accept your opinion instead of mine. I have thought about consciousness for a very long time, and there is truly no definition about consciousness. Even the philosophers that originally discussed the consciousness, they truly said that because I am aware of my surroundings, therefore I am. And we're going to dive into that kind of thinking and see whether there is a truth in that and what is really a definition of consciousness. If consciousness is merely understanding of what goes on around you, then obviously it's not a full consciousness, because I think in terms of what we all think about is not only receiving signals and input from the outside environment, but also it includes the fact that we modify and change our environment. So let's assume we use that criterion, the modification of the environment, as a change in consciousness. And of course, first the signal has to be received by the environment. Is a stone conscious? A stone certainly responds to the environment. It can be moved by water. It can, over decades, can be washed and shaped by water. If the stone is not very big, air movement can move it in a different direction. And of course, the changes that the stone undergoes through because of the environmental impact, then it qualifies as consciousness. So it's very hard, as you can see, to define consciousness in a true and meaningful way. Now let's talk about plants. You can see this on YouTube. You can see two plants are trying to reach to a pole so then they can go up, right? And of course, one of them gets to the pole first. And then you can see that the second one make a decision to abandon that pole, and it goes elsewhere to find somewhere to climb up. So in this case, the plant truly responds to the environment and modify its behavior. So it seems that it gets signals from its environment and modifies its behavior. Therefore, it must be conscious. And certainly animals, we can see them with our eyes, that they continuously monitor their environment. They respond to the stimuli, to their owners, if there's a dog or a cat, and modify their behavior. Pavlov, for example, was one of those early scientists that just saw that every time that he brings food to his dog, he's salivating, right? So he decides to make this an experiment. So he rang a bell when he was bringing the food. And then gradually over time, the dog responded to the ringing of the bell and salivated. So we can see that the animals are aware of their environment and they modify their behavior accordingly. As you can see, it's very difficult to grasp what really means when we say we are conscious. Now let's dive into the consciousness a little bit more. Every night we go to sleep and we become unconscious, right? We are not conscious, or at best semi-conscious, because a noise can wake us up and get us out of our dream. During the night, there is a REM sleep, or rapid eye movement sleep, and we go into this state several times a night. And these dreams appear to be important for housekeeping function of the brain. During that time, these dreams appear to be so vivid that we really think that we are experiencing them. And as you know, some people even get up and go and make a sandwich for themselves. They sleepwalk, right? And sometimes during the night, some people experience terror. It seems that they open their eyes, they can see imaginary beings, and they get scared. But it looks real to them, and they are not fully conscious. When we go and have an accident in a car and go unconscious, we are not aware of our surroundings at all. It happened to me that I had an accident and I have no idea what happened to me during the time that I was unconscious until I woke up in the hospital bed. Another time that we can experience this unconscious behavior from our brain is when we become comatose. And in fact, this happened to my aunt. Because of her aneurysm broke open, she had intracranial hemorrhage and she went to coma for months until one day she wakes up and opens her eyes, and immediately she asked a question that was relevant to her before going unconscious. She wasn't aware of anything that happened in months. So this idea that we are always fully conscious, it doesn't sound right? When we examine the brain waves, obviously we can see this even in the brain waves. When we are active and we are working and we are apparently very conscious, we have these gamma waves that have very rapid frequency. And as we relax, we get the alpha waves, beta waves, alpha waves, theta waves, and delta waves when we go to deep relaxation. And obviously, our consciousness also is varied during all this time, is not consistently the same. And one of the reasons for this is that the brain uses 25% of our glucose. And imagine if the entire brain is used all the time, there won't be any glucose for the rest of the organs. So the brain correctly uses only certain portion of its structure. Now, the idea that in the movie Lucy, that we are not using all of our brain and that we use a fraction of our brain and that we can attain a condition where we use all of our brain is a myth, is not correct. Biologically, we can use every part of our brain. And this depends on what we do. If we put our attention on watching the program on TV, then our occipital lobes are activated. If we are solving a puzzle, the frontal lobes is active. If we hear sound, then our auditory cortex is active. And if you're walking and moving our hand just like I do, then certain parts of our body, of our brain is active. And it is amazing that our right side of the brain controls the left part of our body and vice versa. In fact, the two brains, the two portions of our brain, we have two brains in fact, they are attached to each other by a lot of connections, just like highways. These neurons send information from one brain to the other, so they communicate to each other and they are constantly talking to each other. Perhaps you can see that when you're resting, you can see that you're talking to yourself constantly. And of course, our brain has a dominant part, and in most people, we write with our right hand. Our left brain is dominant, and in left-handed people, the right side is dominant. So this idea that we have two brains, as we talk about it later, is very significant in consciousness. Now, if consciousness is under our control, let's examine it piece by piece. Let's examine the entire central nervous system. Our central nervous system is made of different compartments. And as we go from the lower compartments to the upper compartments, they evolutionarily have been developing throughout time, and the neocortex, or the portion with which we think and we act, it is the latest development that happened in the mammalian species. So the spinal cord, the lower part of our brain, of our central nervous system, which resides inside, and of course it is very soft, it has to be protected by spines. It is inside a canal, and then between vertebrae, you can see these axons are coming out, and it goes to different muscles to move certain muscles in our body, right? But the spinal cord itself is really not conscious, we know that, and its actions are truly reflex. If you stimulate it, it will respond. The knee jerk is perhaps the best example of this being a fully reflex that we cannot control unless we really force ourselves not to respond to someone hitting our underneath our patella. The brain stem is not conscious either. The upper part above, that resides above the spinal cord, is not conscious either. Our respirations, for example, is in a certain portion of our central nervous system called medulla oblongata, and the respiration is automated. Surely you can control it to some extent for some time, but ultimately you give up. I haven't heard of anybody really committing suicide by being able not to breathe. We come up a little bit more, we come to this limbic system where our emotions are, right? Fear, happiness, love, all these emotions that we consider to be human like function of our brain, they are not that controllable by us either. You watch a comic, a stand-up comic, you laugh. Obviously, you don't make a decisions that you laugh when he makes a joke, right? You get terrorized when you watch a program that is supposed to terrorize you. Your heartbeat goes up, and you feel uncomfortable. Do you decide those functions? Not really. So, what about love? Is love in our control? We know it's not. We meet somebody, we like them, then we keep seeing them, and then as we fall in love, obviously, every time that we think of them, our heart beats, and we can't wait to see them, right? But you really have no control over these emotions, which practically are because love hormone increases inside our brain. So we really have no control over our emotions, right? What about other functions in our body? How much control do we have over them? Certainly we can't possibly impact our heart rate, our respiration, our gastrointestinal functions, liver functions, our bone marrow that gives us life by making red blood cells and white blood cells, immune cells that protect us against infection, right? We have very little control, truly, over a major portion of our body. You may say, I'm in control of my movement. Are you really? In a few minutes, I'm going to give you 2 experiments that really defies in our own imagination that we are in control of anything. Really. If you think that you are in control of your movement, I'm sorry to say that you become aware of your movement. When encephalography came to be, an investigator decides to examine this consciousness. So he brings these volunteers into his laboratory and he puts the probe on their head and tell them that I want you to give me a sign when you move your hand. All right? So blink and then you can move your hand. And what astonishes him is that there is a 500 millisecond delay between the time that he blinks and he actually moves his hand. He becomes aware of his movement at the same time that the observer understands that he has moved his hand. 150 years later, we have advanced technology, fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging, a beautiful device that is really being used heavily in neuroscience to understand the brain. What is magnificent about fMRI is it takes advantage of a certain attribute of our brain, as I mentioned before. Our brain is stingy, is not using entire brain all the time. When you focus on something, when you listen to a music, when you're watching the program on TV, that allows certain portion of the brain to become very active. And this activity obviously requires more oxygen and more blood, and that means that the vessels have to dilate. And fMRI captures this increased supply of oxygen and glucose and the dilation of the vessels. You can see them as hot spots on the brain. Scan, right? So, similar experiments now conducted with this fMRI machine by telling these volunteers, giving them 2 buttons, and they say 1 button is for your right hand, 1 button is for your left hand. And what you want to do is, I want you to look at the screen, and when you see an image on the screen, push the button, left or right. There is no right, there is no wrong. And again, the astonishing results emerges. That shows that as we knew, certain portion of the cortex that is responsible for pushing the button either in the left side or the right side, gets active. What they see is the same thing that was seen on encephalogram. They see that 500 milliseconds before the cortex is activated, there is activity in the lower portion of the brain where consciousness doesn't exist, which suggests this beautiful concept that perhaps we become aware of what our brain wants us to do when an observer observes us that we move our hand. We also at the same time become aware of our actions. Obviously, this is not a good idea for our punishment that we apply to people who do crime. Because then what this means is that we are not really responsible for our actions. But obviously all these functions emanate from within our brain. So we have to be responsible for what it does. And obviously a certain level of control is needed in order for the brain not to do anything it wants and perhaps control it. The Greeks have a lot of beautiful things that they said you have to avoid. Gluttony, eating too much, right? They didn't want greed. They didn't want you to steal. The Ten Commandments is very similar to what Greeks recommended, that you really have to control your actions. And obviously, there are a lot of people who are beautiful citizens, law-abiding citizens, and they really do not commit anything awful in our society, but there are others that they do. So what do we do with them? And I'm hoping that with advanced technology, we can reach to a point where we can modify their behavior so they can control these urges of committing a crime, a felony, or the misdemeanor. So if we believe that we have very little control over anything, then are we truly conscious? And do we really have free will? Well, to a certain extent, you can say yes, because obviously you can one day decide to become a physician, a lawyer, an accountant, and you go to school and you're very persistent. Ultimately, you become a doctor, an accountant, or an attorney. But is that sufficient evidence that we are truly conscious? What if we are merely a receiver, similar to a radio or a television? Obviously, if you don't know anything about radio, you just hear the cosmic background hissing sound. You have to put it on certain channels, stations, either the TV or the radio, to hear or watch something. What if this concept is true about human beings? What if we receive signals and our brain automatically responds to these signals? Some of those urges certainly comes from within. You don't really decide to become hungry, right? You become hungry when the leptin levels in your blood changes. And then you can't resist to go to the refrigerator, make a sandwich and eat it, right? You are not really putting yourself to sleep. You become sleepy first, then you go to sleep. Other body functions that we do every day are not being really messaged by our brain. It's our internal organs sending these signals. When the glucose levels come down to about 60 or 70, you're really famished. You have to eat something. When your kidney has allowed a lot of water to be drained from your body and your blood, obviously you become thirsty, but you don't tell yourself that I'm thirsty first. You get the message from your internal organs. So some of these messages definitely coming from our internal organs, and we become aware of them and we respond to them. The same thing is true about external stimuli. We respond constantly to these stimuli that we receive from our environment. A telephone call, talking to someone can make us happy, can make us angry. We don't necessarily, when we talk to somebody on the phone, decide to either be happy or angry. One of the intriguing neurons in our brain that they're truly fascinating, that control a lot of things about each one of us, are the so-called mirror neurons that are scattered throughout the brain. And there were two sets of investigations done by two groups. They wanted to know, one group wanted to know where the empathy resides. And empathy is really a truly magnificent attribute of human being, probably one of the best. It allows us to feel the pain of others. When you see you're driving in a highway and it jammed, and then you reach to a point where you can see the police is taking care of those people who are hurt. Obviously, the first person who sees the accident called 911. This is in most of us to a different extent. These mirror neurons exist. So the second group was interested to see where is the location for the neurons that make decisions for us to succeed in life, to make decisions and crystallize our visions of our tomorrow. And these actually meet in international meeting, and they coined the term mirror neurons to these beautiful neurons, because they can internalize the outside stimuli and allows us to feel the pain and suffering of others. And the second idea is that when we make decisions about our own future, we first make that decision inside. And then obviously with our actions, we externalize those when they become reality. So there is this beautiful internalization and externalization of stimuli that actually drives a lot of our actions. And I think people like Tesla, Mother Teresa, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, these people, in all likelihood, that have tremendously more number of mirror neurons in their brain. And that speaks loud and clear why they did what they did and what allowed them to win Nobel Prize. And of course, as you know, Tesla rejected the idea to get Nobel Prize because the name of the Edison was on that Nobel Prize. But these people are truly magnificent people. And they are magnificent because their success is really attributable to having a lot of mirror neurons. And that brings me to the idea that we really have, all of us have to encourage the development of empathic ideas in our brain, because it increases the number of these beautiful neurons, angelic neurons, that allows us to feel the pain and suffering of others. And imagine, the story is really more beautiful than you can imagine. We come from the so-called protocells, which they lived 2.5 billion years ago in the oceans. And these cells, they were completely selfish, like we are. They lived for themselves, they prayed for themselves, they grew for themselves, they divided for themselves, they gave to progeny. And obviously that went on for a long, long time. One day, one of these cells that was a factory of energy decides to enter another cell that was having flagella, and it was moving, but very slowly because it wasn't able to make a ton of energy. And that became an endosymbiotic relationship that allows the evolution to take a leap. And in a span of 600 million years, we went from single cells to us. It allows colonization of these cells, a specialization of these cells, differentiation of these cells to all these beautiful sensory organs that we have. It allowed us to develop the brain and our motor function. And that cell still exists in all of us. It's the mitochondria, the factory of energy. They also exist within plants, by the way, the chloroplast. So this beautiful, unselfish behavior, a cooperation, allowed evolution to take place. Imagine that. We, as a child, grow to be selfish. We go to school for ourselves. We marry for ourselves, we have children for ourselves, make a family for ourselves, we buy a condo, a house for ourselves, we have our own car, right? A selfish, truly selfish behavior. Because we, at this point in time, we are aware that not the entire world has this beautiful life that some of us think that is God-given, gift to us. We know that not all mankind are living under equal condition. And that is because we are resembling those early ancestors of ours that were truly selfish. What if we decide to increase our empathy for our fellow brothers and sisters? After all, we all come with a single mother, a real Eve who lived 150,000 years ago in Africa, right? Truly, we are all sisters and brothers. We come from the same mother because our mitochondria comes from our mother, not from our father. Our father doesn't contribute to any of these mitochondria that we have. So and this mitochondria actually has DNA, mitochondrial DNA, the same way that we have a genomic DNA in our nucleus. There is a mitochondrial DNA. And this DNA, when you trace it back, it takes us back to that woman who was African, who was black. And I just fail to understand the idea that although the science is telling us that we are all from the same heritage, that we are not truly empathic towards each other. And imagine what will happen if we allow our selfish behavior to go away and evaporate, all evil to go away, and we become truly empathic. What happens? I think you will notice that our world becomes much more beautiful. We have to look at everyone else as if it's our member of our own family. And that is possible within our own reach. If we decide to increase our empathy, our neurons are increased. And that, by the way, increases our success in our lifetime. We all are responsible for our own happiness and our own success. And our success really relies on the idea that we allow our empathic neurons, our mirror neurons, to develop, and we cherish them, and that will change our lives. Imagine that you are within a sphere, and the surface of this sphere represents all the probabilities and likelihood that you possibly can experience if you make certain decisions. And those decisions are really a flashlight that is given to you. And you can shine this flashlight on anywhere you want on this sphere. And depending on where you shine on this sphere, your experiences, your realities differ. And of course, you only can experience one reality. So if the quantum wave and quantum probability, the uncertainty principle is true, and anything is possible, and it comes to fruition only if you view it, then you are in power. You are in control. And the best way to control your destiny and your future truly is if you increase your angelic neurons, your mirror neurons, because that guarantees that you can have more of the neurons that give you the ability to succeed in life and cherish your life in a better way. Well, if we believe the Einstein idea that the past and the present and the future, they all reside in the same membrane, and the quantum eraser experiment has already shown to us that perhaps the entangled particles always behave, no matter whether one is impacted in the future, it impacts the behavior of the other. It brings us to the possibility that maybe the future version of ourselves can impact us at the present. And if that is the case, if you ever make a decision to become empathic, not only we can guarantee your success, but because we are a greater human being, we are bonding with other human beings. Therefore, our future version of ourselves guarantees that it will signal us to make us happier at the present time. I believe that the human being at this time has to make a decision to become unselfish and think to become a superorganism like our ancestors did. And imagine what happened. Evolution took a completely different direction by marriage of one cell with the other and forgetting the selfish behavior that they had. They colonized and they got together, and evolution eventually brought us here. So I think by learning from evolution, we have to now evolve and become a superorganism that encompasses the entire Earth by being more empathic and understanding that we are not really separate from anybody else who lives at this time on Earth. And it is our duty as a human being to change our behavior, our thoughts, and our selfish thoughtfulness and become an unselfish society who cares about everyone else. And I think that will empower all of us to be happier in our lives. I can guarantee that. And I want to thank you for being patient to sit with me. And in the future podcast, I'm going to definitely talk about this development of superorganism as how it will happen to the mankind, and hopefully it will happen sooner than later. Thank you so much.